Gives that weird shape to the third ventricle with the two little prongs sticking out. And this area that I'm touching right here is hypothalamus. Okay? So when we look at the regions of the hypothalamus, in some of the structures that we see are a little easier to understand if we understand their embryonic development. So here would be lateral ventricle and third ventricle within our developing embryo. So the wall of the third ventricle here is hypothalamus. All right. Out here would be the skin of our developing embryo and the mouth area. So as the brain is developing, we're also developing an area of the eye, all right, called the placode. And part of the floor of the third ventricle, where the hypothalamus is attracted chemically to the developing surface of the eye and grows outward. And I'm going to continue this drawing, okay, so you may want to wait for just a moment. Influences chemicals released from this neural tissue growing out from the floor of the third ventricle, the hypothalamus, affects the surface of the face where the eye is developing and causes this surface to evaginate. And the two grow towards each other. This structure eventually fuses and separates from the surface. And the optic nerve structure then forms this intimate association with it like this. Now I've drawn proportions out a little bit. Anybody know what this would be for the eyeball? The lids, formed of layers of epithelial tissue, like an onion. And this double membrane structure is the retina. It has two parts to it. The inner part is the nervous retina, not nervous, just where the nerves are. So that's where we have the rods and cones, the photoreceptors, and the bipolar cells. The optic nerve tissue itself is going to develop from that layer. What develops from this outer layer here are the pigmented cells. So it makes the back of the eye black. And we'll talk about additional functions when we get to the eye. These two never grow together. So have you ever heard of a detached retina? Yeah. Someone gets a blow to the head, or they have diabetes for a long period of time, and that can weaken the structure. And they'll often fix it by using lasers to spot weld the two membranes together. But the reason is from this embryonic development and that cup-shaped structure. And they grow as two separate layers because it kind of enfolds on itself and creates that separate layer. So if we're back at the hypothalamus, we're seeing this optic nerve, all right, as an outgrowth of the hypothalamus. And so it's association with that. Another structure that grows out from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And it will grow down like this. And from the roof of the mouth of the developing embryo, the rest of the pituitary gland develops. And eventually, this association is lost in most people. Some people are born with a small little cyst or channel connecting the roof of their mouth to the pituitary gland. And we have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. This is what sits in the cella turcica that we were talking about with bones. Now, for a long time, the pituitary gland was considered to be the master gland of the body because it released chemicals that went throughout the body and regulated the ovaries and the testes and the liver and adrenal gland and so on, the thyroid gland. But now we know that the hypothalamus itself, not only does it make some of the neurons, well, all the neurons, it makes neurons that are sent down into the pituitary gland, and these have large swellings, and they release chemicals, which are really neurotransmitters, but because they get into the blood and travel to their site rather than crossing a 2-nanometer cleft, they are called hormones. Because most neurotransmitters just go from one nerve to the next, or a nerve to a muscle. And these get into the blood and go to organs. The two types of neurotransmitters that are actually made by the posterior pituitary. This part's for free. We'll do it in endocrine, so I'm just going to put it up here, but you don't have to know the names of these hormones. Just know that they exist. The first one is known as oxytocin. If you've had a child, this is what causes the uterus to contract under the positive feedback of the pressure of the fetus's head or bottom, depending on which one's coming out first. And it can continue to release after the baby's born whenever the baby nurses. And it helps to maintain the contraction of the uterus. And it also helps to release the milk. So the milk letdown response. When a mother hears a baby cry or as her baby starts to suck, there are cells around the milk, secretory cells, that help to compress them and release the milk. So that's oxytocin. The other one you guys have as well. And this is anti-diuretic hormone. It goes to the kidneys and increases the reabsorption of fluid from the urine. So it makes your urine more concentrated if you're not drinking very much. Okay? They're actually neurotransmitters. But because they're released into the blood, they're identified as hormones. And they're made by the hypothalamus. All right? Now, in addition to that, we have hormones made by the anterior pituitary. And again, this is for free. Growth hormone, hormones that control the ovaries or the testes for making estrogen, testosterone, hormones that control the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, hormones that control the adrenal gland. But guess what tells the pituitary gland when to release those? We have other neurons in the hypothalamus that release their neurotransmitters into the blood. I'm looking for blood vessels. Oh well. And these blood vessels carry those to control the anterior pituitary. Again, for free. Feedback mechanism. This is how the birth control pills work. So normally when your estrogen levels are up, the hypothalamus doesn't make FSH and LH. All right? And therefore eggs don't develop and they aren't released. When estrogen and progesterone levels are low, then the hypothalamus releases chemicals that go to the pituitary gland, cause FSH and LH to be made, goes to the ovaries, the eggs develop, your cells start making estrogen and progesterone, those levels rise, and we have this seesaw effect. So what birth control pills do is keep the levels of estrogen and or progesterone artificially high so that the hypothalamus doesn't release the chemicals and the pituitary gland doesn't release the chemicals that cause the ovaries to cause the eggs to mature. So it's a blocking that effect. And so while this is, yes, controlling other organs in the body, the hypothalamus is actually either making hormones or making control factors that allow the pituitary to function. So it's really the behind-the-scenes master of all the puppets. Okay? So in addition to all of that hormonal control, the hypothalamus is also going to regulate body temperature. It is the one that sets your body temperature at a certain set, and if it gets hotter than that, then you start sweating and you get red so that the heat is radiated. In young babies and in older individuals, that doesn't work very well. So you may have gone to visit an elderly relative and you walk in and it's 85 or 90 degrees in their house or their apartment because they're feeling cold, and you're sweating like crazy, but it's because their hypothalamus is losing its ability to regulate body temperature and to set their body temperature. There are also receptors in the hypothalamus for the amount of sodium ions. So if that level gets too high, you feel thirsty. And as you drink more water and it dilutes out the sodium ions, you feel less thirsty. So it regulates thirst. Same thing for glucose levels. So it helps to regulate hunger. You know, we can kind of trick the hypothalamus by drinking lots of water and swelling our stomach, because the stretching of the stomach also sends a signal to the hypothalamus. So if the stomach is stretched out, even if there's low glucose levels, for a short period of time, we can fool the hypothalamus into thinking that we're full. So sensations of thirst or not thirst, hunger, or being full is done by the hypothalamus. In addition, it regulates the autonomic nervous system. And that's all I'm going to say for now, because in our next unit of the nervous system, we do a lot with the autonomic nervous system. But for reference sake, voluntary motor nervous system, when I determine that I'm going to push my hand out like that, what part of my frontal lobe is firing to do that? I first think about it in the frontal cortex, and when I do it, what part is firing? Precentral gyrus. All right, so we have a clear-cut pattern of control for voluntary movement. For involuntary, autonomic function of the heart, or smooth muscle of the digestive tract, or the erector pili of our skin, most textbook descriptions start with the nerves that are leaving the peripheral or the cranial nerves. It's like, well, what tells it to do that? So my heart rate is beating. What tells it to beat faster? Yeah, I know the signal is getting there from sympathetic nerves coming from my thoracic spinal cord, but what causes those to become activated? And again, hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is in effect the frontal lobe factor for involuntary motor neurons. That's all we're going to say for now. That's all you need to know for now. For the first nervous system, is just hypothalamus regulates autonomic nervous system control. And we'll look at slightly more detail how in our second unit. Not all emotions, but rage, and aggression are the hypothalamus plays a factor in that. And I'm trying to think, anything on the list I've left out? That's part of the reticular activating system. So I'll bring that in when we talk about the reticular activating system in just a sec. Okay. And that's the part of the limbic reticular activating system factors. Pineal gland. All right, pineal gland starts with P, as does pituitary, but they're not the same thing. And this works with the hypothalamus in sleep and wake cycles and with the reticular system. So pituitary gland is out of the floor of the third ventricle. Pineal gland is out of the posterior roof of the third ventricle. And I've made it big here. It's really big in the sheep brain. So the hormone associated with the pineal gland is melatonin. You can actually buy forms of melatonin in the drugstore. People that travel a lot to help regulate their adjustment to jet lag. Some of them will take it. Humans rarely have a regular schedule. Okay, so sometimes I'll go to bed at 9, sometimes I won't go to bed at all, sometimes I'll go to bed at 1:30 in the morning, and some people will work swing shift, and then they'll work day shift, and then they'll work night shift, and so we're constantly upsetting our diurnal or our daily cycle. But if you put a person in a cave without any lights at all, okay, and just monitor their metabolic activities, they will settle into an approximate circadian rhythm, which is around 23 to 26 hours. And hormone levels will rise in the fall. In response to that, it's not just a wake-sleep cycle. Birds and lots of farm animals often our cycles on a circadian rhythm cycle. And every time they want to change the daylight saving time, the farmers get upset because it's going to throw the cycles off for their sheep or, their cows for milk delivery or whatever. But the pineal gland, again, part of the endocrine system. And on Thursday when we do the sheep dissection, you'll be able to see it really clearly. Some of our models show it and some do not. But even the ones that do not, like this one doesn't, but it has this peak band, and right where that swelling is there is where the pineal gland would be. Okay, so pituitary is this pink structure here, and pineal gland would be just above that pink, is about a pea-sized structure in the human brain, about the tip of your little finger. Is about the size of the pineal gland. So all of that is diencephalon. The last structure I want to talk about for the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. The mammillary body as part of the hypothalamus, and so we'll discuss that as part of the limbic system, but I want you to recognize it as a component of the hypothalamus. Okay? The mammillary body works with the hippocampus in laying down short-term memory and its conversion to long-term memory. So that brings us to the limbic system.